To help us get started, it's my great pleasure to turn to my friend Ambassador James Smith, former U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Ambassador Smith.
Thank you, Lincoln. It's good to see you again, and it's good to be with all of you today as we discuss the challenges associated with Iran and the region. Now, for my part, my connection to the Iranian people goes back to the late 1970s, because as a young Air Force lieutenant, I was a T-38 instructor pilot in Del Rio, Texas. And from 1976 to 1979, I trained Allied students to fly. It's perhaps hard to imagine today, but we had classes of Saudi and Iranian student pilots together. And I came to admire those Iranian students for their determination to excel. And in retrospect, they were some of the best students that I ever flew with. So perhaps you can imagine the sadness that I felt several years later when I found that most of those young men had been summarily shot for the simple crime of having been trained by young lieutenants like me. What I didn't know at the time was that this was not an aberration for the regime in Tehran, it was the standard. And some project that as many as 120,000 Iranian citizens have been killed by their own government since 1979. And that is a number that rivals the number of all other terrorist incidents since and including 9/11. Now, when I arrived in Riyadh as U.S. Ambassador in 2009, I was not new to the region. I had been an F-15 pilot during the first Gulf War, flying out of Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. I traveled extensively in Syria, Jordan, and Israel, and I spent time in the Gulf as a businessman. I was not fully prepared, however, for the level of stress that Iran had put on the region as a result of their strategy of destabilization. And from the Saudi perspective, Saudi Arabia was being encircled by Iran's incessant drive for instability. Their support for Hezbollah had brought instability to the Levant. The well-funded support for Hamas had helped undermine the support for the Arab Peace Initiative, which is an issue that was very dear to the leadership in Saudi Arabia. For years, the Saudis have complained of the Iranian support for the Houthis in Yemen, and only now does the West realize the Iranian level of support. Further south, Iran's influence with the Sudanese government has enabled the transfer of weapons to Gaza, has provided support to a myriad of extremist entities in the region. To the north, the impact of Iranian influence on the Maliki government has all but ensured a government unwilling to embrace minority representation. And the resulting chaos benefiting Daesh is the direct result of Iranian destabilization strategy. In Bahrain and in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, Iran continues to foster sectarian conflict in an effort to destabilize these long-standing U.S. allies. Further, Saudi Arabia has been attacked directly by Iran. The cyber attack against Aramco is well documented, as has the attempted murder of the Saudi ambassador to the United States on American soil. Iran's policies have also caused the United States to pay a heavy price. Their role in the Beirut bombings in 1982, the bombings in Africa, and their contribution to the deaths of hundreds of American soldiers in Iraq all add up to a reality that Iran has not been held accountable. Now, while many have commented on the Saudi-led coalition effort in Yemen, this does represent the first step by the Gulf Arabs to say, Iran, we've had enough. Stop. I applaud the message. Likewise, I applaud the efforts to arrive at an agreement to limit Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons over the next decade. In my view, there are only two questions to be asked. Is the agreement enforceable, and does the United States have the will to enforce it? If the answer is yes to both, then the deal makes sense. Now, there are many who are making rational arguments for and against the deal. But I want to take you back to 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was a young fifth-grade boy in elementary school in Fayette County, Georgia. And it was within the expected range of the missiles that were in Cuba at the time. And every day during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we would have nuclear attack exercises where the horns and the bells would go off. We would turn the tables and the desk upside down and crawl underneath those tables. And all the while, all the kids in the school were crying and scared because it was fear. Those were the days when people were digging fallout shelters in their homes. My point is that this is not just a rational argument. It is very, very emotional. I do not want my friends to have to go through that experience, to live in a life in fear of nuclear weapons in the hands of an enemy with a track record of terrorizing the region. So yes, I support the agreement. Now, others will criticize the negotiations because they were not expansive enough. Some would say we should have negotiated prisoner release, or that the debate should have also focused on Iran's behavior in the region, in addition to the nuclear portfolio. I agree that these issues are keenly important, but from a negotiator's viewpoint, it is not a good tactic to introduce areas that are not core to the problem at hand, because you end up negotiating away things that are important to get concessions on things that are not core. I am in the camp that says, focus on an enforceable nuclear deal first, then realize that the real work has just begun. So let's assume that the agreement will be ratified and put into practice. The nuclear agreement will have been an immensely important undertaking, but the real work is in bringing stability back to the region. So step one is a commitment to ensuring compliance with the provisions of the agreement and to hold Iran accountable. Any deviation must be confronted directly, publicly, and in front of the international community. And we must hold the coalition of the willing together to reassert sanctions in the face of any deviation. Step two, in parallel, we must turn our attention to the stability in the region. And the real test of our diplomacy will be in our ability to bring Saudi Arabia and Iran together for an honest dialogue about how they see the future of the region. Arguably, the chaos in the region is the byproduct of failed foreign policy on the part of both of those countries. Iran wanted instability, and Daesh is the child of that policy. An extremist group that vows to behead every Shia that come in contact with as they move eastward. I would argue that's not the kind of instability that the leadership of Tehran had in mind. And you can create chaos, but you cannot control it. For the Saudis, in an attempt to counter the Islamic Revolution, they funded their ultra-conservative brand of Salafism. And in their mind, they were exporting stability. Because quietist Salafism, as it is called, demands support for the ruler and actively discourages protests and the overthrow of a ruling establishment. Unfortunately, the unintended consequence of this strategy is that they exported intolerance. And that, too, is a primary ingredient in the chaos of today. So for these two very important countries, the time has long passed where finger-pointing is sufficient to achieve regional security objectives. It is time for real dialogue, and I believe the United States should rise to the challenge of brokering that dialogue. And step three is a focus on change within Iran. President Rouhani made many campaign promises, and achieving an easing of sanctions was one priority. But he also committed to easing political controls, to providing more freedom to Iranians, and to address the sources of friction between Iran and its neighbors. The real work is to enable President Rouhani to make good on the rest of his campaign promises. And to this end, the United States can play a key role. Now, our support for democracy and democratic principles has taken many forms over the decades. After a long and checkered history of supporting what we saw as stability in Latin America, our encouragement of democracy led to sweeping changes in the landscape of that continent. Eastern Europe looked at us with hope as the Soviet Union fell. We all felt pride in watching Lech Walesa lead the democratic movement from within. Somehow, I think we lost our way and assumed democracy could be imposed from the top. And our success in that endeavor has been much less successful. Iran, however, has a long tradition of political involvement by the people of that country, and we should encourage and build on that tradition to encourage change from within. Unfortunately, the concept of soft power has fallen out of favor for some because it doesn't sound tough enough. I would argue that our road to success lies in the connection between peoples. Leverage the Iranian diaspora to maintain connections with the people of Iran. Encourage cultural exchanges and provide robust student exchange programs to include the exchange of American students. And finally, leverage the power of the information revolution to connect people with ideas. The iPhone and the BlackBerry have truly changed the social contract between governments and people in the region, certainly in Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf. In the past, that social contract was between a government and its subjects, and control was the operative word. A government will control their movements and the information available to them, and if there is only one source of information, that's all they knew and that's all they needed to know. That's all changed now with the ubiquity of information, where people have access to information from across the globe. They no longer see themselves as subjects. They see themselves as citizens. We must take advantage of that opportunity to influence. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Ambassador.